is Juliana. I'm the racial justice intern, if you haven't met me. And we've been working on these brown bag series and incorporating elements of racial justice awareness. And Tobin Shearer is here today as part of that. He's associate professor of history at UM, and he is the head of the African American Studies Department. And he's been working in this area for about 15 years, is that right?
More like 25 by now. 25.
That's a little bit different, 25 years. And so he's done a lot of these presentations. He's a little bit of a local celebrity on campus, so we're really excited to have him here. And I hope you all enjoy. Feel free to ask any questions at the end. This is going to be fairly casual, pretty conversation-oriented. And so we look forward to your participation. Thank you so much and enjoy.
Thanks, Juliana.
It's particularly fun to be at an organization that I walk into the building and it has the word eliminating racism out front. I think you know how rare that is, not only in Missoula but in the country more broadly. And I'm familiar with the history of the YWCA, and I'm privileged to be here to talk with you in a context where you've placed that and empowering women at the center of what you do. A couple more words about myself. Whenever I walk into a classroom for the first time on the first day of a semester, I often have students look at me and walk out of the room, particularly if it's one of my core African American Studies classes, because they don't expect to see a white guy come in to talk about the black experience. I say that because I want you to know that I know I'm a white guy. Very clear about my identity, and on that first day of class, I usually will go out to check if that's in fact why they've left, to let them know that, yeah, you're in the right place, let's talk about why I'm here. And so we have a conversation about my life experience, the work I've done within the African American community, the conversations I had with my African American colleagues to see if they felt good about me taking this position, and how I hold up that tension with my students as we progress. It's a good tension, one that we explore together in the course of the semester. But just wanted to get that clear so you know that I know who I am. I'm going to cast my comments and our conversation primarily in a frame of a story today. It's a story about how a group of people who were working to try to dismantle racism in their own context came up with an idea that helped them better understand what racism was, and through that, understand other ways in which our society offers oppression and privilege. It's a story that's ongoing. It comes out of an organization that I helped found. Myself and an African American woman back in 1995 founded an organization called Damascus Road. It was an anti-racism training collective. We worked for about 15 years. That's where the 15 years come from. And then I've continued to do it since that time, at dismantling racism, particularly in the context of Mennonite and Brethren in Christ congregations, denominational offices, colleges, and universities. So we travel around the country working with groups. About 3 years into that process, we were up against an impassable wall. This is what we discovered. As we'd been traveling around the country, talking with white people and communities of color, it became very clear to us that people were talking past each other. We weren't the first ones to have come to this observation, but we did notice that more and more, as white people would talk about the problem of racism in society, the conversation would be cast in terms of interpersonal relationships. How do we all get along? It would be reflected in Hollywood films where you have usually a white lead with a black, brown, yellow, red sidekick getting together. And there's some sort of resolution at the end of the film. And that's what way white people were thinking about racism and talking about it. How do I relate? Do I have a friend from another person who's another person of color? Do I say bad words or not? Am I a member of the KKK? As we would listen to communities of color talk about racism, we heard something else entirely. We heard people talking about racism in terms of systems and institutions. So how are we being treated by the criminal justice system? How are we being treated by the educational system? Do we have access to health care? Can we rent a house when we show up after having talked with someone on the phone. So out of that conversation and working with other allies across the country, we had been able to come up with a definition of racism that we found helpful, a way to help people talk to each other. I'm guessing some of you have heard of this definition before. It wasn't original with us. But the way we began to define racism was to say that it wasn't just the function of interpersonal relationships, i.e. race prejudice, that which would be expressed primarily on an individual level, but it also needed to include an analysis of systemic racism. Who's seen this kind of definition before? Show of hands. Okay, about half of you or so. This worked really well for us. Once we could have conversations where we would define what race was and how it had been developed over time with very specific intention of putting white people in positions of control and authority and people of color in secondary positions in society, talking about the reality of prejudice in a race-based society, suggesting that everyone has some kind of race prejudice. It's not endemic to a particular racial profile. We could also then talk about systemic racism. We could talk, systemic power is what I wanted to put up here, plus systemic power, and the ways in which that was expressed at multiple levels of institutional life, often without people needing to intend to do it or not. The systems acted on their own behalf. So this was a good thing for us. We even began over time to say, well, you know, it's not just systemic power, it's really the misuse of systemic power. Because what that slight change allowed us to do is to recognize that power wasn't a bad thing. It was how you used it and how you expressed it. That's what was important. But it was the combination of that misuse of systemic power with race prejudice that was racism. So I'm going to ask us to do what we would frequently do with groups at this point. We'd simply ask people to come up with as many questions as they could about that definition. What issues does it raise for you? What don't you agree with? What do you want to know more about? So we'll do it real quickly here. Take a minute or two, turn to a partner, and come up with 1 or 2 questions per group about this definition. What does it raise for you? Or what do you think other people might have questions about that definition? That clear? Go ahead, turn to someone, come up with a couple questions about that definition. Okay. Let's hear some of your questions. What kind of issues, concerns, queries emerge as you look at that definition? What were you talking about? I'm real good at calling on you, so why don't we start over here? Tell us what questions you have.
Well, to me, the misuse of systemic power encompasses so much as far as class and male, female, that it's kind of hard then to trace out which would be race and which is just...
Good, good. You're introducing into the room the idea of intersectionality. This is an important concept that's come to us primarily through the womanist tradition, coming through African American women initially in particular, who were dissatisfied with some of the ways they saw white feminism emerging, particularly in second wave feminism, where they said, we can't just talk about our identity as women, gender, we also are experiencing oppression based on class, based on gender all the time. So we want to be real clear, even though we're focusing on racism today, we want to be making connections with other forms of oppression. At the same time, one of the things we observed in working with this definition in predominantly white groups, that sometimes would result in people not dealing with race because they found it easier to deal with other kinds of oppression. So we're going to stay focused on race, but constantly bring in connections as we move forward. Thank you for introducing it. Intersectionality is really important. Other questions? Back in here, a question from any of those groups. It's all, you got it covered, no questions.
Well, we had, the big question, how do you begin to change the system, and do you start with changing yourself first, or you work with changing the system first, or, you know, how do you begin?
Boy, I love it when people have a question that is the exact point I want to end up with by 1 o'clock. So we're going to go there, but I'm not going to jump there yet. But thank you for pointing to where we want to go. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is, like, once you identify that there is a misuse of, you know, the systemic power, how do you measure, how do you quantify that? How do you explain that to people? What kind of data would you collect, and how do you look at that?
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that we also began to realize in working with this definition is that many of the organizations we were consulting with were basically evaluating their work based on their intention. We really want to be anti-racist, instead of evaluating the results of what the organization or institution was actually doing. So your question points to the importance of the evaluation of the institution and how we go about assessing that. And that was the problem that we were just stopped by. So we're going to work more with that, but that's exactly one of the questions that was stopping us. Go ahead.
That's where mine goes too, is like a little bit into the intersectionality where, you know, what smaller issues come out of, you know, these bigger ones like lack of health care or, you know, lack of education, and what results in that, you know, maybe like looking at mental illness or, you know, homelessness or whatever it is, and like just the smaller things that come from, you know, how the system is set up in the first place.
And again, an observation that we had gotten this far was to recognize that often groups would say they were looking at another ism, say that was issues of classism or homelessness, whatever, and they said, that's the only thing we're really concerned about. And our analysis was that racism isn't more important than any other means of oppression, but if you don't have a clear analysis of it, you go about that work in racist ways. So you could very well be concerned about analyzing and responding to homelessness, but if you weren't clear about your racial prejudices and the misuse of systemic power within your institution, you could end up being very racist in that process. So that also was stopping us. How about one more question, then we're going to move on to what we tried to do as a result of that. Another question back over here in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a little confused about how you're talking about it, because I thought we were talking about, when you say misuse of systemic power, I thought you were talking about like structural racism.
Absolutely.
And what I hear you talking about in your work was that you were looking at the work of the groups that you were training, or whatever your role was.
We were working with institutions. Our analysis was that institutions are the primary component of systems. And so we developed, well, I won't jump to where we're going, but that was part of our issue. How do we have those institutions begin to understand their place in a system? Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And there was in the back as well.
Yeah, my question was just going back to what you were saying, was that, so, because this like formula is like racism equals race prejudice plus misuse of systemic like power. It's almost like you could have those two separate and it would still be racism. Is that right? Like they don't have to go hand in hand. Like you could have a system
Right.
that then you could use race prejudice in there, and that would be racism. But the system didn't necessarily have to be like a misuse of power. Is that correct?
I think I'm understanding your question. Correct me if I'm not getting at what you're raising. One of the things this definition suggested to us was that everyone has race prejudice on an individual basis. It gets expressed in different ways, regardless of your racial identity. But it only means something systemically if you have access to power in order to, and the systems will act on your behalf in order to implement that in society. So we could also talk about gender prejudice plus the misuse of systemic power becomes sexism. Class prejudice plus the misuse of systemic power becomes classism. But we do think, according to the definition we found helpful, for this to actually be racism, you have to have both components. Does that make, and that was what we found helpful. It's not the only way of approaching it by any means. Am I getting to what you're asking?
Because I guess it was just bringing up the question that you were saying, if someone was going to actually try to like eradicate or kind of work on some kind of racial bias or component, like in a like in their business or something.
Right.
They could go about it incorrectly, but it wouldn't necessarily be the misuse of like a systemic power, but it would be a prejudice that would come into something that could be good, but it's separate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think where we were stopped by was we had this definition that helped clarify what was prejudice and what was actually racism and point us in a different direction, but we couldn't help people understand more than that. And I think what I'm going to talk about now will get to what the concern you're raising, which is a really important one. So I'm going to continue with the story. Thank you for these questions. They're great. So in the late 90s, as I said, we've been working with this definition for about 5 years, traveling around the country, and we were stopped this far. Because we were aware that, as you're suggesting, racism looked different in different places, and we were having a hard time figuring out for ourselves how we could talk about that difference in order to establish organizing plans that would actually deal with the underlying problem. My wife's a nurse, and she's taught me that our diagnosis determines our therapy. How we define a problem is going to shape how we then in turn go about developing a solution. So we were sitting on the sun deck of my colleague Brenda Zuck-Friesen's house, struggling through this. We'd been at it for about 3 or 4 hours, and then none of us could remember who was the first one to raise the metaphor. But someone said, well, you know, maybe it's a bit tired metaphor, but it really is looking like an iceberg. Oh, what do you mean? Well, we began to talk about it. I'm not an artist, but my friend Conrad Moore, one of our trainers at that time, was, and he actually developed these great three-dimensional models of icebergs from what we came up with over time. We're going to deal with just one side of that iceberg today. But this is what we came up with as a way to talk about, conceive, and then develop plans for addressing racism by talking about the systemic misuse of power. What does that look like? Well, we think it looks like an iceberg with three levels or 3 parts. These are the 3 parts. And I'll tell you what they are in a moment. So before we get into that, let's talk about icebergs for a second. What do you know about icebergs?
Most of it's not visible.
Yeah. Does anyone know the actual percentage of what you see above and what you see below?
Like 10% above, 90% below.
Absolutely. You only see 10% of an iceberg above the water. The rest is beneath. Anything else we know about icebergs?
Some of the Titanic.
They're quite dangerous, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're not only dangerous to the shipping industry. When icebergs get too close to a coral reef, they can actually render them sterile for miles by scraping the life off the coral reef. Anything else we know? How big are they? Really big indeed. In 1956, off the coast of in the Antarctic, they measured an iceberg that was 207 by 95, I think it was 95 miles wide, roughly the size of Rhode Island. Huge, huge icebergs.
I just heard on the news this morning there's one that just broke off of Antarctica, and I can't remember what country it's the same size as. But
Another huge country, yeah, they're immense. And we're actually hearing more about them with issues of global warming at this time. Okay, so we got the basic concept of an iceberg. You see a little bit above, a lot of it remains below. This is what we learned to talk about. Above the surface of the water, we said, well, you know, that's the oppressive power of racism. This is racism's ability to oppress, demean, harm, imprison people of color, whether Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, or any other racially oppressed group. The problem is that's usually in the white community all anyone knows about racism. That all it does is hurt people of color. I want to be real clear that the harm that it does at this level is really important. It's incredibly damaging. The question we began to ask each other, though, is if that's all we know about the way racism operates, all it does is hurt people of color, what's our therapy going to be? What's our therapy going to be? If all we know it hurts people of color, what kind of programs are we going to design, do you think?
How it hurts other people? How it hurts the oppressive group?
Yeah, if all we know is that it hurts oppressive group, what kind of programs are we going to design and respond to that? What?
To eliminate racism?
Yeah, we're going to try to have it stop hurting people of color, right? We're going to develop programs that are designed to fix people of color because racism has broken them. As we talked more about it that Tuesday afternoon in Baltimore, we realized that, well, you know, most of those programs that are operating off this assumption are usually run by white people. Most of the white people are defining the problem from the beginning. Most of them are doing the financial fundraising. And there's very little accountability, control, or often even involvement in the design of the programs at this level. In fact, I worked for about 6 years in New Orleans in a predominantly African-American community known as the St. Thomas Irish Channel part of New Orleans. And there was a group there of organizers and residents of a federal housing project that said, you know, we're really tired of having people come into our community, tell us how they're going to fix us, put the program in place, get a lot of money from outside, and then leave. So they sent a letter to every single nonprofit organization who was working in their community, and there were a lot of them. You no longer have the right to use statistics about our poverty without getting our permission. And not only getting our permission, but we have to be involved in the solutions that you're going to identify. So we said, all right, oppressive power. That's an important thing. We recognize that that's what most white people know about racism. But there's more to it, right? I mean, we know this from the definition, that it's not just about oppressive power. There's another level. What are we going to call that level? We're going to call it white power. Oppressive power, white power. This systemic misuse of power at this level is racism's ability to provide and maintain power and control for white people regardless of our desire for that to be the case. It's about giving access and control to white people in institutions and systems. So I'm a historian, and I, some others in the group, having worked with a group called Crossroads Ministry, remembered something we learned from them. We remembered that one way of looking at U.S. history is to recognize that every major institution and system in the country of the United States was established with the purpose of serving white people and white people exclusively. Oh. How can you make that claim? Well, this is where you get the benefit of a semester's worth of history in the next 5 minutes. So we're going to pretend that we've got a timeline here representing the history of Europeans in North America. So when does that history of Europeans in North America begin? You've all learned this in 2nd grade.
1492.
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? So we're going to just imagine a big 1492 here in this corner. Okay, that's going to be the beginning of the history of Europeans in North America. We're going to go over to this next corner over here.
Some of us Scandinavians would dispute that.
I know, absolutely. Leif Erikson might have something else to say, right? We're going to go with 1492.
Even the Chinese.
Ah, yes, yes. We're still going to go with 1492. That corner over there, we're going to say is another important turning point in U.S. history. When does the Civil War end?
Next year.
Good. 1865. 1492 to 1865. What else happens in terms particularly of the African American community in this country in 1865? Emancipation, proclamation's a bit earlier, but yeah, we get full emancipation by 1865.
Only for black men, though, not for black women, right?
Emancipation, all were freed.
Everyone was?
Yeah, absolutely. The right to vote did not come till much later, and that was just men. But 1865, yeah, all African Americans were freed. Although we know there was news brought to some communities later than others. For example, in Texas, June 19, there was a delay in the information, so they found about it well after the Emancipation Proclamation. Anyhow, 1865. We have another date over here that's, again, important in legal prudence in this country, where the Supreme Court made a very important ruling about education. What was that ruling? Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. 1954. 1954. We're going to put that in that corner. So what's the number we got here? And that one there? And this is? 54. And this is today here. So this timeline, imaginary timeline we just made in this room, represents, with caveats, the history of Europeans in North America. Now, I'm getting back to my claim as to how I can say that every institution in the United States was designed, created, and instituted to serve white people exclusively.
It's probably appropriate in this context to say that Scandinavians don't consider themselves
Europeans. We'll go with that. That's good. Now, as I've set up this timeline, I haven't set it up in equal portions. From 1492 to 1865 represents, as of today, about 72% of the history of Europeans in North America. It's a big chunk of time. During that chunk of time, United States legal code mandated that every institution in this country had to serve white people. Why? Native Americans were not counted at all, and African Americans were considered how much of a person according to voting laws? 3/5. So the law and the institutions that are being developed during that 72% of the history of Europeans in North America were just focused on making sure those institutions mostly served white men. There was secondary service to women through husbands and brothers and uncles, etc., but it was white people as a whole, mostly white men. 1492 to 1865. That's 72% of the history of Europeans in North America. Now, if we extend that history over to 1954, after which our country's apartheid system was rendered illegal, remember now that South Africa based its apartheid system on us, 1492 to 1954, United States legal code allowed for and mandated that those institutions should serve white people first in a superior fashion. That's 89% of the history of Europeans in North America. It's only been in this last 11% between 1954 and 2013 that we thought we should do something else other than have institutions that served white people. The issue has been, at this level, those institutions have mostly thought the way we go about changing that problem is simply to make the institution look more colorful. We put different faces into the institution, but we don't actually change the way the institution structure has put in place for that 89% of the history of Europeans in North America. So I got a chance to do that little history lesson with my colleagues. They were very thrilled to have me do a history lecture on a sun deck in Baltimore. No, they weren't. But we did come to realize out of our conversations and those with other colleagues in other institutions that this isn't the purpose of racism, to oppress people of color. The purpose of racism was to ensure that white people maintained control and power within their institutions based on that history and present practice. It's here, to use this metaphor and extend it perhaps far beyond where it's worth, that the ice of an iceberg is strong as cement. It sort of just drives home the point that that's the core, the purpose of the way racism operates and why it's been put in place. Okay, that was a breakthrough for us. All right, we got this whole thing. It's a great metaphor. White people only see what's above the water. There's this whole thing beneath the water. But then we said, but there is another level yet in the way racism operates that really is its most insidious level. It has to do with the fact that because this oppressive power is in place, because white power is in place, it shapes identity. So this is the level of identity power. And it's here we need the language of psychology. And in the context we were working at that time, we also need the language of spirituality in order to understand the way this racism is operating. And we noted that it had really different two expressions. It had internalized racist superiority and internalized racist inferiority. I'll talk about them briefly. This was the level at which racism worked as we were beginning to work it out in our conversations and work, in which white people's identity was shaped to have themselves think of themselves being superior, and people of color were being socialized to think of themselves and their mores and ways of being as inferior. And we began to tell stories as we sat on the deck about what that looked like. We remembered the time when the co-founder of the organization, Regina, and I were leading a workshop on racism with faculty of a college in northern Indiana, Goshen College. Regina was at the front of the room working with this group, white people, people of color, doing a great job. Then we got to a question and answer point, and someone asked a question not of Regina, but of me. And here where we have to acknowledge the connections with race and gender are very closely aligned. When Regina tells the story, she says she's very clear it was a dynamic of race, not so much gender in that setting. But at any rate, they ask it of me, and what do? I stand up at first, a little bit to the side, and I respond to the question. Then someone else asks the question, they ask it of me again, and within a space of about 10 minutes, Regina was sitting down, and I was up the front of the room leading the group. That was all about both of these things, as we talked about it through tears and pain that following evening, where I had allowed my superiority to assume that I could simply step in and take over, because I really was going to do a better job than Regina was at that point in time. And she had allowed some of the socializations of inferiority to let me do it. And it was an insidious dovetailing of both of those dynamics in that time. And we actually dealt with it that evening. We were able to stop the training the next morning and do a debriefing with the group and say, hey, did you know what just happened? We played into this very thing that we were trying to undo together. This is racism's ability, as a colleague of ours in the Crossroads ministry used to say, to create racists and victims. It's at this level where white people are created into racists and people of color are created into victims. It's very insidious, it's often very subtle, but it's also very powerful. Because what you do is have people who really mean well otherwise cooperating with the very thing they're wanting to dismantle. So we had this conversation on the deck in Baltimore and thought, damn, that's pretty good. But then someone had to complicate it by saying, wait, we've missed something really important here. As we talked about these different things and we came up with examples, we realized we've missed the whole dynamic of the way racism operates. We haven't talked about the power of culture. So that opened up a whole new conversation. We began to say, well, what is culture and how is it expressed in the context of racism? We began to articulate that cultural racism is simply the ability to make someone else do life a certain way. That I'm going to say how you have to do your life. We know examples of this in a context like Montana, in the Indian boarding schools, for example, where missionaries most often, educators as well, would force Native American children to do life their way, involving cutting their hair, not being able to speak their language, being removed from their familial settings, etc. So we said, oh gosh, how does that fit into this metaphor that we're trying to make work to help people understand how they dismantle racism? Oh, someone says, it's really the oxygen throughout the whole iceberg. Because cultural racism has expressions at all these levels. It can oppress people of color, it can ensure that white people get power and privilege, and it can play into systemic and institutional dynamics. So we worked with this for a while, and we began to then make it not just a single dimensional object. We began to talk about it having 3 sides or dimensions, that these different levels are expressed at the dimension of institutional, individual, and systemic. So if you can imagine an iceberg having these 3 sides, that these different levels are impressed on individual levels, they're impressed in institutional manifestations, they're impressed in systemic manifestations as well. Again, we would then develop over time the ability to talk about the way in which institutions constitute a system, and the example of the Brown versus Board of Education is probably our best example of understanding how that works, where we're able to make a change in a given institution, the very particular dynamic of schools and the segregation that affected an entire educational system. And then in turn, that system had interlocking effects with healthcare, with criminal justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'm going to stop my story here for a second again and do the same thing we did before with the definition. And that is to turn to the same people you were talking before and come up with some questions about what I've just told you. This is a lot of information that I put in the room. This is really something that should, by rights, have a couple days to work through. We're just sort of putting in the room for conversation's sake. But go ahead. What kind of questions, things you don't agree with, things you want to know more about? Go ahead. Have conversation. Things you need to be clarified. Just at least 1 or 2 questions per group again. Go ahead. Okay. Let's hear some of your questions. And I'm going to call on the group I was talking with over here. Mary, right?
Yeah.
Mary, can you talk about your question observation?
Well, I have a hard time articulating this, but obviously all parts of the iceberg are important and need to change, but if you can't change that middle part, and you have, the others won't change, but to change the middle part, you have to find some way of the balance of the white power working together with the oppressed people. Otherwise you get, like he was talking about, you can't have just white people coming in to fix a problem. But you need to have the white people in white power changing a system. So how do you balance how do you get them working together?
Really good question. There are 2 answers to that question, I think. One is the answer I know best from working with other white people. And then there's the question that people of color also have to talk about. I talk about there are 3 paradigm shifts that white people need to go through. The first paradigm shift is to recognize that racism is not dead. Oppressive power still continues to oppress people of color on a regular basis. The second one is to recognize what's beneath the surface of the water, that the purpose of racism is indeed to serve white people and keep white people in positions of power and privilege. That's a really difficult. This isn't quite as difficult paradigm shift for most white folks. Getting to this one is. But what's really difficult is the recognition, that third paradigm shift, is that the receipt of white power shapes us, shapes our identity. That's the most difficult paradigm shift for white folks to go through. Then there's a parallel process within communities of color, as I hear my colleagues talk about it, of particularly, that's very clear within that community. This is very clear within that community. This is much more difficult. Getting it to understand the dynamics of internalized racist inferiority and how then people of color can at times play into a racist system by allowing white people to be in positions of power and privilege. That's probably not as how I should phrase that, but that can be a supportive leg to that as well. When communities are able to be clear about both those things, then the possibility of coalitions can emerge. There are some other training organizations here who jump to that coalition building across racial lines without being clear about this. And our observation has been that in the process, those groups invariably trip up in this level. They can't get past it. Because the white folks get defensive, the people of color, again, are talking past each other, and we've seen coalitions time and time again begin to fall apart because they don't have a common analysis and a common language about the way racism operates. So the work that this group that I was a part of began to do is to say, okay, our task in order to change systems is to work at institutions that can then be effective partners with communities of color to actually go about following some of their direction, being accountable to those communities, and begin to make a change where we're not the ones deciding what the problem is and what the solution is. Great question. Question from back here, comments, observations.
The cultural piece was very interesting because in the institutions you know, in that whole middle system, it's just white culture and white way of doing things, and you know, you want to become more diverse or more whatever, but it's still within the context of that cultural overlay, and I think the cultural part is really, really closely connected to your identity. So if you can't bring in a real cultural shift within the institutions, then how are you going to shift that identity?
Oh, yeah. It has to do with our understandings of conflict, our understandings of time, things like how we dress and how we're perceived because of how we dress, all that kind of. I could tell lots and lots of stories out of the organization I was placed in when we were developing this paradigm, where we began to include people of color in the organization, and those are the issues that were the initial forays. That was where we first began to have the conflict. Yeah, go ahead.
I just make a comment. I just recently spent 60 hours watching The Wire. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Baltimore, but you mentioned Baltimore, and I thought, what a perfect example of all of those levels of systemic power and racism. I mean, it's difficult to watch, but a really good example of what.
It's a stunning show, and is a textbook presentation of the way racism operates. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we could take this and apply it to every single episode, and you could do an analysis. Great. Questions over here? Comments, observations? Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question. It sounds like you're saying that having a shared analysis is enough, and it seems like really doing the internal work individually is also an important component of that, and that part of the key is convincing white people that we're being hurt by the system as well.
Absolutely.
And that the strength will be,
Absolutely.
you know, once people of color can fully participate, once women can fully participate.
Absolutely. I mean, we could make the same arguments about sexism in men.
Yeah.
That men, we are harmed by the way we participate in a sexist society. Same sort of thing with white people and racism. The way I got into this work was having worked in New Orleans for 6 years. We had some great mentors, great people who were working with us. And I was thinking, I'll probably stay here. I'm connected to this African American community. It's going to be a great place to be. Why would I leave? But I had a conversation with a friend of mine, David Billings, that was very formative in that regard. He said, you know, you're getting this stuff pretty well, Tobin. You need to go back to your own people. You need to work with white folks in your religious community and see what can happen. So there was a number of things that came together to make that possible, but that was a turning point for me of recognizing that my path was not primarily to work within communities of color as an organizer. It was to work within white communities as an organizer and educator to help them come to new understandings of the way racism operated in our society. And that was a profound shift for me. It was not one I really cared to do, because for me that was way harder work. And in fact, it proved to be over the course of the next 15 years. I won't go into all my personal story there, but We have seen significant shift within the organizations we worked with. It's come at personal cost to myself and others who were involved that were no longer welcome in many of those settings, but yet the changes have taken place in profound ways. One of the things we can point to in the context of the Mennonite denomination that we did some of our most consistent work working with this kind of analysis is that we now for the first time have a woman of color who is the moderator, and she just pointed this out to me not so long ago, but of all the major sub-institutions, mission agencies and educational institutions, I think 50% now are led by women or men of color. That had not been the case when we began this work 15 years ago. And that's not enough. It's still a staff change, but it represents changes in culture and institutions and systems in that denomination. And we are not the only ones, but we are a very important part of that shift. So I think you're right. There is individual work that needs to go on to make this happen, but there's also a collectivity that needs to emerge as we have these kind of analysis becoming more common. I heard some great stuff going on over here. You care to bring any of those comments into the room from anyone on this side of the room?
I guess I just, like, I understand that the individual and the identity part of it is really important on an individual basis, but it's also hard to, you know, think about people who aren't interested in diving that deep, you know, and ways like, I mean, is it ideal to start at the bottom and work your way up, or is it, I mean, because, like, you know, as people who, you know, are recognizing, like, the issues in our community, it's easier to really address those issues, like, you know, criminal injustice and things like that. But it's so much harder to, like, really reach out to individuals and have them, you know, do that work. And so I guess it's just, you know, where to kind of put that effort in.
I understand the sense of being overwhelmed and not certain of how you move forward in this.
Yeah, I guess.
And I'm afraid to report humbly and initially that there are no grand plans. We don't have them. What we have is analysis. We have the possibility of collectives emerging. We have groups who have modeled some ways to work at this and done so effectively with a lot of error and trial along the way. There are other community-based models that are trying to work at some of this. The work that we've done, this group that was gathering on that porch on the sun deck in Baltimore, was focused on transforming institutions. YWCA has been part of that kind of work nationally, of trying to develop an analysis. If I can venture a very gentle criticism of the YWCA in the process, it's been my observation from the outside that you don't have a very clear analysis across the board as an institution about what this racism is that's in the front of your building. I think I hear a lot of different definitions and approaches coming through. And I think that's probably a problem that needs to be addressed within your own organization. You're way far ahead over many. But, and you correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's just something I've observed from the outside.
But the C still does stand for Christian.
It does?
No.
No, if you ask almost anybody that's not directly involved, that's what they'll tell you.
But
And that's the way they think of it.
That's a
No,
perception.
the YWCA changed to YWCA. That's the official name, YWCA.
So it's not an acronym anymore?
No, and it identifies as a secular organization.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought so.
But
People don't know
And you're
that.
right, I'm not really told.
but not if you ask the dominant white culture.
Sure.
You know.
So a last coda to this story, and then we'll be done. So this group, as I said, met. We came up with this. We were pretty excited about it. We began to develop a training that introduced this over actually a period of about 3 days. We developed a 3-day model. It's still going on. There's one that's going to be held. My wife's niece is going through the training. Today's Friday. They'll be starting this evening for the first time. And she's heard me talk about this in family gatherings for years. And it just tickles the cockles of my heart to hear her say she's excited about going to one of these workshops that for the first 10 years we had to struggle to get anybody to go to at all. So this group got together and began to develop this kind of model, working with groups across the country for the next 10 years. I've mentioned one mark already of what this analysis did. I'll refer to another. This is now 20 years since I was invited to come up to work at our national headquarters for the Mennonite Central Committee. It was the Relief and Development Organization of the Mennonite Family of Churches. And the executive director at that time had invited me to write an article about racism for the church publication. I included in that article the first definition I started out with. She said, no, we're going to cut this out, we're going to censor it, it's way too controversial. You just can't have that in front of the church. It won't work. So it was cut out, and this little fluff piece ended. I was embarrassed to see the article come out under my name. 20 years, let's see, it's about 20 years later now. Gosh, I feel old. There's going to be an article that I was asked to write by the editor of the same church publication now 20 years later, in which I no longer have to have that definition because it's so well known in the church. I'm now writing at a very different level, talking about this same iceberg, and nobody's objected. In fact, they asked for it to happen. And that's been part of that change that we've seen in that organization. I'm going to stop there. I put a lot of stuff over. You didn't even get to finish your lunch. But thanks for coming. It was great to be with you today, and really respect and affirm the work you're doing here. Thank you.